Hello and a very warm welcome to the third annual Rebuilding Macroeconomics Conference. I am Angus Armstrong and I have the great privilege of being director of the Rebuilding Macroeconomics Network. We are a research network, and over the next 3 days, we hope to have a real conversation with all of the participants in this conference. That is because our task is to explore different approaches of looking at macroeconomic challenges. So you're all very welcome to take part, and there'll be plenty of opportunity for discussion. Over the next 3 days, we're going to hear from over 30 scholars. So we have a feast of scholars from a number of different disciplines. So they include anthropology, cognitive science, complexity, ecology, evolutionary science, psychology, sociology, physics, and so on. So a real feast of different disciplines looking at this issue of macroeconomics. And I'm also delighted to say we are joined by 4 policymakers who are really at the very top of policy making to hear what they think are the most important priorities for macroeconomists and macroeconomics to be considering. So that's how we've set it up. And as I say, we hope very much you can take part in those conversations. Just a word about who we are. So Rebuilding Macroeconomics is a large investment by the Economic and Social Research Council, one of the 7 research councils under UKRI. And we were set up in 2017 as a 4-year project. So we have about 9 months left to run, tasked with answering 2 questions. First of all, is there a monoculture in how we approach macroeconomics? In other words, a single way of doing things in terms of how we look at preferences, how we look at behavior, how we look at institutions. And the second question is there perhaps a perceived disconnect between policymaking and academic macroeconomics? So that was the task in front of us. And we were challenged to look for small scale projects which were interdisciplinary and which might not get funding from traditional sources. So our job really was very much sort of, if I can put it, to look around for interesting projects that go to stretch the edges of macroeconomics rather than do an epsilon away from what macroeconomists currently do. So in order to try and do this project, we set this up by having a leadership team which has got more people from disciplines outside of economics than there are economists. So we have 5 people in the research team, in the management group, myself, of course, Dame Henrietta Moore, who leads the Institute for Global Prosperity at UCL and is an anthropologist, Doyne Farmer, who's professor of complexity science at Oxford University, Roger Farmer, who is a macroeconomist from Warwick University and often on the West Coast of America, formerly of UCLA, that's why, and David Tuckett, who is a psychologist also from UCL. So you can see there's 3 non-economists and 2 economists, but what we all share is a common interest in our socio-economic system. So we started off by looking for interdisciplinary research, which is why we have the sort of projects that I mentioned in my start. We're hosted at the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, which I hope you can see in the photograph behind me, which is an oasis of calm in an otherwise excited Westminster over the last couple of years. And I should also extend my thanks to Jagjit Chadha, who is the director of NISA, for giving us a space to explore some of these ideas that sometimes challenge the orthodoxy, because that's clearly the mandate that we've been given. Now, the next steps and what we're hoping to get out of this conference, from this conversation, is as we're entering the final stages of our research grant, which by July we're hoping that will extend to July 2021, we have to deliver to the ESRC a roadmap. So that's kind of the conclusion of all of these research projects. And if I can just read you out what that roadmap really is, you can see the size of the challenge, which is at once very exciting, but I'd admit to being slightly daunting as well, that's confronting us. This roadmap has to include a clear mapping of the current research landscape and a coherent research program for macroeconomics. It will have a clear assessment of the potential of alternative new avenues of interdisciplinary research and added value of the proposed new research program in the context of the ESRC's existing capacity and the priorities of the user community, which is why we've been so keen to involve policymakers on the side of this. Now, we've managed to fund about 37 pilot projects, which is much more than the 24 that we set out to do. I should probably make an apology to any university administrators listening in for the way that we've negotiated down the costs, but it is public money. And the job we have today and in the next 3 days and in the next 9 months to write this roadmap is to really look at the threads that are woven between all of those research projects. So what are the common themes? And we've organized this conference around those common themes. And if we were to use 2 words to sum this up, we'd say social and interaction. Now, this may seem slightly bizarre to non-economists, but the way that we tend to approach macroeconomics is a large part people have kept separate from each other rather than interacting. Now, one of the sort of things, necessary requirements for interaction is we have to be different. And I should say that since the global financial crisis, there has been some real innovations in what one might call mainstream economics. So heterodox models have come in from the cold. We've got some progress in macroeconometrics to try and address some of the issues that were raised back in the 1970s around aggregation. So there's been, and also networks. I would say probably the 2 best projects to address the COVID crisis have included networks right in the middle of them. They don't consider sectors as isolated parts of the economies. They consider them part of an integrated whole. So there has certainly been progress, but what we want to stress is the importance not only of heterogeneity, but interaction. Now, some people say, but we already have interaction. We have game theory, that's explicitly interaction. We have search theory. That is true. But the way that we set the rules for game theory and search theory is either we use game theory where we say everybody understands what the rules of the game are and don't ask where they come from, or we assume some sort of perceived common knowledge about the economy, and that's how we tend to solve search models. So we're more interested in looking at what the social foundations of these macroeconomic models might be. And I just note last week's winner of the Nobel Prize, Robert Wilson himself, who's obviously a fantastic game theorist, said that they think they've made almost no progress on these foundational questions of how do you set the rules of the game in the very first place. And this is where we think social macro comes in. So that's the idea. One of the great things about once we start taking interaction seriously, we get emergent properties for the economy where the aggregate outcomes, the macro level outcomes, aren't simply the sum of the parts. They become different. More becomes different. So we have a genuine subject of macroeconomics, which is not simply the summing up of microeconomic agents. I think that's very important and one of the key areas we're going to be looking to explore. In terms of how we've set up the conference, we have 3 days, of course, and today is very much looking at the nature of economic reality. The first panel looking at what is the right level of investigation for macroeconomics. Should it be the individual and then the macro, or should we be thinking about social interaction, social structure, and perhaps meso levels, groups, regions, and so on, getting a richer sense of macro. And then once we allow for a social structure, of course, the social structure is never static in any biological system. And this is where contests between competition and cooperation, so fundamental in our lives, leads to evolution and changing behavior. And we have a great panel of evolutionary experts. Tomorrow, it's very much looking at methods of analysis, where we'll be considering as this system changes and evolves over time, we get what some people call radical or fundamental uncertainty, i.e. things that can't be reduced to a probability distribution. It's the only way of really getting at this. What progress can we really start to make in this area? And many of the tools of analysis, although we use the word social, computer simulations are very powerful ways of getting some of these issues. And be looking at disequilibrium models, instability models, from ecology to complexity theory. So that's day 2, methods of analysis. And on day 3, we're looking at ourselves. We're looking at the field of macroeconomics to try and answer the question that the ESRC posed about a perceived disconnect. So we're looking at cultures of expertise, the sort of incentive structures, research frameworks, set up the way that knowledge is passed from academia into policymaking institutions, whether it reflects our democracies. So a very much a genuine debate there, and also listening to the younger scholars, next generation of scholars, what they're hoping for macroeconomics, all of which will be laced with introductory remarks from people from the policymaking community about what they expect. I think it was Albert Hirschman who wrote the book about voice and exit. So we have a choice. We either can have a proper dialogue with those in policy, or we become excluded. And that's why we've taken the decision to start each day with listening to policymakers, first of all from this government, but also from the Bank of England and from the Government Economic Service and from the official opposition, to find out different views and how they see our priorities.